And so I always like to start off with the science of what's happening. Too many people from across society, whether it be companies or politicians, start off from what basically they hope is happening rather than what is happening. And that leads people down the wrong alleys and to the wrong conclusions. So we always have to start off on what the science is if we're going to come to the right solution. So I always start from there. When I'm talking about climate change, whether it be to companies or politicians or who else, stakeholders or whatever. So I'm going to start that here today. And so it's great to be able to start off with the summary of working group 2, the AR6 report, which came out on Tuesday on the impact and adaptation and mitigation opportunities of climate change. And so very simply, Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the UN, summed it up way better than anyone else did when he said that we've seen many reports, but nothing like this. It's an atlas of human suffering and a damning indictment of failed climate leadership. People are anxious, people are angry, and we have a rapidly closing window to secure a livable future for planet Earth. So very, very strong words. The Working Group 2 used even stronger words than Working Group 1, which was released in August, which was a science of climate change. So I'm just going to try and show in the next few slides exactly what he means by that window of closing opportunity, why that's happening, and also just a little bit about that atlas of human suffering. So what else did the report say? Very important, everywhere is affected. We have in the global north a little bit of a fantasy in our heads, like this doesn't affect us. This is something that happens in, as usual, the poor parts of the world, like Africa or Southeast Asia or India. Bad things happen in other places, we'll be fine. This is not true. Everywhere is affected. Some areas are definitely affected more than others, but this is coming for us all. We can see with the incredible flooding and loss of life in Australia over the past couple of weeks, which kind of went under the radar a little bit because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and also just the constant now wildfires taking place in California. So the report said that half the global population, about 3.5 billion people, already live in highly vulnerable areas to climate change. So about half the world's population is already in great danger due to the impacts of climate change. They already face food and water shortages because of climate change at the current level of heating. Never mind getting to 1.5 or 2 degrees like the Paris Agreement. We're at about 1.1, 1.2, and already we're seeing millions of people's lives at risk from the impacts of climate change. This isn't something that's happening in the future. This is something that's happening right now. And that's another kind of myth to bust. We're all used to hearing people say, I'm worried about my kids. Worry about you now. Your kids are in a lot of danger and your grandkids even more danger, but this is something that's happening right now. There's loss of life occurring now. So 1.5 degrees has been designated by politicians, not by scientists, but by politicians in the Paris Agreement as a critical level beyond which the impacts of climate change accelerate strongly and soon become irreversible. And I'll talk a little bit about that irreversibility, but scientists would definitely say that we're in a lot of danger already right now. Never mind waiting for 1.5 or 2 degrees like the Paris Agreement. And the work and this latest assessment by the IPC clearly says that back in 2015, we thought, or people said in their reports, 1.5 are in danger. Whereas this report in 2022 makes it clear that already at 1.1, 1.2, we're in danger right now. And so what the heck is happening? Well, just to be very clear about it, we have pumped an incredible amount of greenhouse gases, mostly carbon dioxide, but also methane, into our atmosphere. And in fact, we have as much carbon dioxide in our atmosphere as the last time there was this much was 2 million years ago, when the world was an incredibly different place and trees grew in Antarctica. And what's different between now and 2 million years ago is that we're making that switch faster than what happened 2 million years ago. 2 million years ago, it took thousands of years to have such an increase in carbon dioxide, but we've managed to do it in about 50. And so we're playing an incredible experiment on ourselves, on our atmosphere, and on our climate. Something that's incredibly important to the success of the human race is climate stability. All of human civilization, agriculture, food surplus, recorded history has happened in the last 10,000 years since the mini ice age of 12,000 years ago. And and you can see it at the very end of this chart, that very kind of consistent greenhouse gas carbon atmosphere that we've had at around 280 parts per million. So all of human civilization has occurred in this really small window with a really consistent climate. And as you can see from this chart, we've absolutely blown that. And we're in a different atmosphere than any human being has experienced before. And we don't yet fully know the impacts of that, but we're trying to figure it, scientists are trying to figure it out as we go along. But this isn't something that's happened by nature. It's not a natural disaster. This has been done, and it's predominantly been done by a relatively small group of companies and countries. So the biggest emitters of carbon dioxide being the oil and gas industry, Shell, your Exxons, your BPs, your Gazprom from Russia. Also, people who finance it, JP Morgan, the #1 financier of fossil fuels, investing millions and millions, and still, even though climate change is so obviously a massive danger to the human race, still ignoring Paris Agreement and continuing to invest. And the #1 private user of fossil fuels is the US Army, whose job, of course, also is to protect fossil fuel supply lines and pipelines in the Middle East. So I put this slide up because we often hear that we're, as in there's a big we when people say we're causing climate change. Well, actually, you can point to a very specific group that's causing climate change. And it's this group. And there's more added on to that. There's the politicians who facilitate them. There's more of the banks which lend them the money to drill. And there's the marketing and the PR agencies that help give them license to operate. But you need to understand the target and the people doing it, and this is the people that are responsible. And also, I'd add on to that, Saudi Arabia is state oil and gas producer. Saudi Aramco, the #1 producer of fossil fuels in the world right now. So this is who's doing it, and we're currently tracking, global warming is currently tracking at worst case scenario, what the UNIPC calls worst case scenario. So as I say, we're at about 1.2 degrees warming. On land, the oceans actually absorb most of the heat. About 90% of the heat is absorbed by the oceans, and that's causing its own massive problems to food that we get from the oceans. But on land, we're at about 1.2, and it would actually be at about 1.5 if it wasn't for additional pollution, silicon particles that we pollute into the atmosphere that actually radiate some of the heat back. But we're at about 1.2 degrees warming at the moment. I just want to touch on the part of the UN report which talks about runaway impacts of climate change. And you'll often hear the word tipping points used. And there's about 10 or 12 of them. But the most important one, they're all important, but the most prominent one that's really going to get us and cause us an incredible amount of trouble is the what's called the albedo effect. And it's happening in the Arctic and Antarctica. So the albedo effect, maybe you've heard of it before, but it's the reflection of light energy back off shiny surfaces. So if we take the Arctic, of course, it's full of ice, and the Arctic and Antarctic act as the Earth's air conditioning unit. They keep us cool. Sun's radiation light comes down to the Arctic. It hits the white surface of the ice. It bounces off back into space. And when it hits ice, about 90% of that energy radiates back into space. But as the Earth warms, the ice melts. And we're all familiar with the picture of the polar bear floating away, and we go, oh, poor polar bear. But it's far worse than that. As the ice melts, deep blue ocean is revealed. And the ocean is really good at absorbing the Earth's energy. So that absorbs about 90% of heat. So instead of 90% going back out into space, you've got 90% being absorbed. That continues to heat the Arctic and Antarctica. The ice gets smaller, and more heat is absorbed. And so we're losing Earth's air conditioning unit, what's keeping us cool. And if you look at Antarctic and Arctic sea ice extent right now, there are lowest levels ever. And really, it's very hard to see how human civilization survives without the Arctic and Antarctica. for sea level rise, but also it could lead to runaway climate change we just can't control because it just keeps getting hotter and hotter and hotter. So the albedo effect and the melting of the Arctic and the Antarctic is something really to be aware of, because that's a huge danger. And as the IPCC report says, we could have already gone past this tipping point. We just don't know yet, or it could be at 1.3 or 1.5 degrees. But as soon as we do, we have an absolutely massive problem for survival of the human race. And there's nothing. We absolutely have to refreeze the Arctic and Antarctica. So that's something just to be very aware of. It's not as simple as temperature kind of keeps going up. There are these tipping points that if we pass, we're in huge trouble, and that we need to solve real fast. And here's just an advertisement from an early Exxon Mobil, where they advertised that their burning of oil and gas was enough to melt 7 million tons of glacier every year. So a great advertisement from history there, a humble brag. But they wouldn't put that ad out anymore, of course. It's the 1970s, I
1970s. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Another thing to know about global warming and that kind of slow progressive 1.1, 1.2 degrees, it's of course not about just temperatures getting a little bit warmer every day. That's not the effect it has. The effect that it has is that these small changes in averages lead to big changes in extremes. So none of us would really worry if every day was just like 1 degree warmer, right? But we wouldn't complain. And that's where people often get climate change wrong, is it's these small changes cause big changes in the extremes that we see. So just a 1 or 1.5 degree change in temperatures brings heat, much bigger and longer heat waves, more droughts, and more bigger weather bombs like we've seen in Australia. So that is kind of a big part of climate change that people get wrong. It's about a big change in extremes. So for example, the last big change in our climate that we had was the ice age about 12,000 years ago. And the average change in global temperature to cause an ice age that covered Europe and North America was 4 degrees, the other way. So we're at about, as I say, 1.2 now, going hotter. So you can, of course, know that if there was no human civilization during the ice age, everything's come past that. Human civilization doesn't work with those big changes in extremes. So that's another thing kind of to understand, is it's about big changes in extremes despite the numbers being quite small. So current things like literally happening right now, as I say, we have the weather bomb in Australia. We have a famine in Madagascar, again, not widely covered in the newspapers, where about over 1 million people are at risk of hunger and death on a huge scale, called the first climate change famine. And of course, we have global wildfires and wildfire season extending everywhere. So just to hammer home the point, definitely not something that comes in the future, something that is happening and is a risk to millions of people, including ourselves, right now. So what's going to happen this century if we continue doing what we're doing, if we continue on business as usual? What does it mean for the world? Climate change, once you get above kind of 2 degrees, it's very hard to predict, because you have compound impacts, but there are some broad strokes that we can take. So if we're heading for about somewhere between 3 and 4 degrees by the end of the century. If that is to happen and we continue on this course, it would render the planet unrecognizable from anything we know right now. What is going to happen is the low and mid latitudes will be uninhabitable because of heat stress and drought. And this is something that is already happening. It's called wet bulb temperature. And basically at 37 degrees, where humidity is high, the human body can no longer function. And we're seeing a lot of cities in the central bands along the equator and India already experience wet bulb temperatures, where if you go outside and you're exposed to wet bulb temperatures, even for a small amount of time, it brings death. And many people are already kind of dying in this way already, but we just very rarely hear about it, but it's happening already. And as temperatures increase, wet bulb temperatures will become more common, especially around the equators, rendering them uninhabitable. Certainly North Africa, as we saw in the latest IPCC report, from probably around the 2040s, will stop being able to produce crops and food. Southern Europe, Spain, Italy, southern France as well will turn to Mediterranean desert. Southeast Asia is under a huge strain. Southeast Asia is a breadbasket, feeds millions of people, especially in China and Indonesia. And it's very low lying. So what we're going to see there with the melting of Antarctic ice sheet and Greenland glacier is sea level rise, which swamps the paddy and the rice fields with salty water, and rice cannot grow in salty water. So we're going to see major destruction of food crops. That's going to push food prices up globally, lead to starvation on huge levels in Southeast Asia, and may cause the collapse of the world's commodity and food markets. And that's according to the former head of the UK's Climate Change Advisory Committee. And he's by no means a kind of an environmentalist. He's a knight and a lord, and that's his take on what he sees happening. So if we continue on this route, by the end of the century, probably Earth could fit around 1 billion people, and when we're currently at 7 billion people. So this is obviously a situation that we don't want to occur. It doesn't have to occur. It's all in our power to stop it. But if we continue doing what we're doing, this is the outcome that we're going to get. What would this mean for Ireland in the short term? What do we have to look out for here? Well, number one is obviously we're an island, so sea level rise is huge. I think we've got something like 45% of our population lives within 5 kilometers of the sea. So we're at huge risk from sea level rise. Dublin Bay sea levels are rising at twice the global average rate. And so, to quote Dr. Peter Thorne from Maynooth, it's not if we need sea defenses, but it's how tall we build them. And this is going to be absolutely essential. We should have started building sea defenses 20 years ago. We're way too late to this game. We need a massive public infrastructure works of sea defenses and flooding defenses throughout the country. Flooding as well from not just the sea, but from fluvial flooding, from rain and from weather bombs, because storms feed off the Earth's energy. They feed off the Earth's heat. The more heat there is in the world, the more water is soaked up from the sea, the more it's deposited on Earth. So hotter Earth means more rain, means more flooding. And that's going to be a huge problem unless we kit our towns and cities out with big flood defense works and adaptation schemes. And then water stress as well. What we're going to see going forward is that there's going to be more drought in the east of the country, more rain in the west of the country. That's a bit of a simplification, but what we're going to see definitely is water stress and drought in the east of the country, as a country that relies a lot on agriculture. That's going to be a huge problem for farmers. And so we're going to have to figure out a way of conserving our water and managing it very economically and strategically. And we're definitely going to have to plug all the leaks in our water infrastructure, because at the moment, I think 50% of our water is lost to leaks in a Victorian kind of aging water system, and that can't be allowed to happen anymore. So those are some of the top impacts we're going to see for Ireland, starting pretty much immediately. So who is burning all the carbon, though? And it goes back to my point where I think it's very important it's not it's specific people that are doing this. And the average carbon footprint of the top 1% of people is 75 times higher than the bottom 50. There's a group of wealthy people on planet Earth that are taking far more of the carbon than they're entitled to. And they're the rich, they're the wealthy, they are the privileged, and they're leaving the most vulnerable, the people who are using the least, to effectively die from what the top 1% are doing. So you can split it by income. So you see top 10%, top 1% using many more times the bottom 50 or even the middle. And we see it by country as well. The United States, unsurprisingly, way out ahead in terms of carbon footprint per person, then Europe, then Russia, then China. And you have to go kind of all the way down to India before you get to the 1.5 degrees, in line with 1.5 degrees of use per person. Everyone else from Latin America, China, Russia, Europe, United States, way ahead, and leading by Europe and the United States. So often, you hear commentators complain about China or India, but really they should look to themselves first. It's the United States and Europe leading the way in terms of consumption. And very clearly from these charts, we see the top chart is who's producing the most carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases, and on the bottom globe we see who is most at risk of the impacts. And they almost are a direct flip on each other. People emitting the most are at the least risk, and it's the most vulnerable, especially women and girls at the bottom, who will be the first to feel the impacts. And so with all this kind of information kind of freely available, the impacts of climate change and the fact that it's the most vulnerable at risk, the fossil fuel companies over the last 20 years, maybe even 30 years, have been playing a massive disinformation game to try and question the science and basically really, really slow down people taking action on climate change. So there's whole books written on this, but just to give a couple of examples, we have Exxon's classic campaign from the 90s and the 2000s, funding a lot of op-eds in places like the New York Times to question the science of climate change, when Exxon's own scientists, all the way back to the 70s, were saying to Exxon that climate change is real and a big problem. And it's freely available now. Exxon's board reports from the 70s, where they knew that what their product was doing, but yet they spent the last 20 to 30 years trying to stymie all sorts of effort by saying that questioning climate science. And unfortunately, it was really effective and it worked very well. But they knew they were lying through their teeth. They just wanted to keep burning and keep making profit. And we also have BP's approach. They hired in the 2000s a PR firm that most famously worked with the tobacco industry. And they wanted to get regulators and get public opinion off their back. So they invented the idea of questioning your own carbon footprint. So instead of people looking at the oil companies, looking at the politicians, etc., and saying, what are you going to do about it? Stop your emissions. They put the emphasis on individual action. And that was as well extremely successful. So they got people walking around going, what about my plastic straw? What about this, the other, despite the fact that BP were the guys pumping out all the greenhouse gases. So this is just a small kind of example, but of the ways that the fossil fuel industry has stymied action and gotten us to this place where we are on the brink of climate catastrophe, but they're still continuing to do it to this day, and it's a big problem. Yeah, individual changes are necessary. We should all do the right thing, right? Because reducing your greenhouse gas emissions is the right thing to do. But it's not. It's if you don't change the system, we're completely doomed, because our choices are, for many people, are very limited. Like we generally have to get in the fossil fuel car because of the way our society is set up. It's so all invasive. And the reason that it is so all invasive in our society is people like Exxon and BP have been stifling action, preventing the alternatives, shutting down the renewable research, renewable investment, any opportunity that they can. And that's why our options are so limited at this stage. It's been a purposeful campaign, and then they go, judge your own carbon footprint. It's your own fault. So I'd never tell anyone, don't do the little actions. That's fine, but without challenging and taking on these guys and stopping them, we're doomed. And we have to change the system for sure, or else it's not going to work. So just a few things on Ireland, and this, a lot of these points came up as part of the Oireachtas climate change committee meetings that were happening in January and February as the carbon budgets were being designed. And so just some key points that I think are really important. So even allowing for the global banking crisis, for COVID, Ireland's emissions in 2020 are the exact same, basically, as they were in 1990. We have not changed. In that period, we've gone up and come back down, but we're still at the same as 1990, which is absolutely mad. Ireland has territorial emissions of carbon dioxide per capita that are 17% above the average for the EU. So we are at like the top 2 or 3 per capita emissions in the EU. We're a big emitter for our size. The average Irish citizen has a carbon footprint 27% higher than the average Chinese, 75% higher than the global average, and 10 times higher than a typical African person. We are big, big emitters. And so this is something that always kills me when people go, Ireland's a small country, what can we do? Well, we are kicking the world in the nuts with our pollution at the moment in an extremely unfair way. And it shouldn't be like that. Ireland is a rich country. Our GDP, we know that it's a flawed system, but it places us as the world's third richest country. I saw that Pascal Donoghue announced yesterday we unexpectedly collected an extra €1 billion in tax for February. We're an extremely rich country, over twice the spending power per person of the average EU, 5 times the global average, 16 times that of the African citizen. If we can't lower our emissions and do climate adaptation, who can is the point. Like, we are the perfect country for it. We've got a huge coastline, extremely favorable wind regime, and high tidal ranges. We are extremely well served for developing renewable energy. Unlike Denmark, who started it 30 years ago, we don't even have a planning scheme for offshore renewable energy. We are in the Stone Age here, despite the fact that we have a huge opportunity to supply not just ourselves, but Europe with renewable energy. The perfect solution to Putin's gas hold on us. We should be supplying renewable energy to all of Europe. It should be an economic boom, jobs, careers, everything. We've not started. We're not out of the gates on it, and it should be a national embarrassment. So to talk about our carbon budgets for a little bit, carbon budgets are very useful and important because they tell us how much carbon we have left to emit before we hit these magical 1.5 and 2 degrees targets as set out in Paris. So globally, we have a carbon budget left of around 270 gigatons before we reach 1.5 and 680 for 2 degrees. If current levels of emissions persist, and by the way, they're currently increasing, they would represent in 8 years, so about 2030, we get to 1.5, and 19 years, we get to 2 degrees. And keeping in mind that probably at 2 degrees, we see definitely major collapses in the world economy and commodity markets. However, so these are global values. And Ireland is a rich country, and we have signed up, not just words, we've signed up to equitable carbon budget sharing with the rest of the world, which means as a wealthy nation, we have a much smaller carbon budget left than the average, because less developed nations need to use some greenhouse gases in order to adapt and prepare themselves for the impact of climate change. So our fair share of carbon budgets is around 120 million tons for 1.5 to 300 million tons for 2. And we really don't want to go to 2. 1.5 really needs to be our max. So at our current rate, we hit our fair share of carbon budget for 1.5 in just 3 years' time, and for 2 degrees in 8 years' time. So we are running out really fast, and our emissions are still increasing. So if we wanted to hit this, we'd have to have an emission pathway reduction of about 12% per year to hit 2, and 30% to hit 1.5 starting immediately. So the carbon budget that was just set and we voted through by the Oireachtas, set by the CCAC, that is going into law for an emission reduction of 4.8% per year from 2021 to 2025. So as you can see, 4.8% is neither 12% nor 30%. It is not our fair share. It is not enough to meet even the minimum requirements on an unfair share to hit 1.5 degrees Celsius. So what Ireland is effectively doing is stealing carbon budget from vulnerable, poor communities, predominantly people of color, predominantly women and children, and we're using it for ourselves, mostly to drive our SUVs and eat beef burgers, etc., etc. But we are responsible for a death sentence for climate vulnerable communities, and this is abhorrent, and it needs to be stopped. We are part of the problem on a huge basis. So what should we be doing? Like, there's many things, but what are the basics? We need a fair carbon budget, one that is equitable and fair with the world. And that's going to require us to make significant greenhouse gas reductions from agriculture to transport. We need radical change, and people need to be leveled with. People do not understand the risk to life and the risk to all of our societies, food, shelter, all of it that we're about to experience in the next 10 to 20 years. And that means everything needs to change. The system needs to change. So we need to pursue a fair carbon budget. Opportunities, we need to get after renewable energy. We need planning regime for offshore wind. We need a hydrogen strategy to replace fossil fuels, hydrogen power strategy. These are basics that our European colleagues have had for years, and we need them. It's a huge benefit. And we need to really invest in adaptation. So what I mean by that is we need the sea defenses, we need the flood defenses, we need to be building infrastructure that is not climate resilient to where we are now, but climate resilient to 3 and 4 degrees, that we look at the world in the future and we build to those specs. Even just look at the best, literally the best bit of public transport we have right now, which is the DART. When we have a storm, when we have heavy rain, when we have sea swell, it goes underwater. And that's where we even are at 1.1 degrees. So like the bottom line is we need societal transformation. We need complete system and mind shift change to reduce our consumption, to reduce the focus on wealth accumulation. We need to use public resources, taxation, to make a more equitable Ireland and invest it into excellent public services, into flood defenses, climate adaptation, and then we need to share that expertise with the rest of the world and be a good friend and be an equitable partner to the rest of humanity. Because we really, really, really are at the last chance saloon here. It's all about to go to shit, and we're doing nothing. In fact, we're actually increasing our greenhouse gas emissions. And this is the perfect antidote, as it's in the news, obviously, Ukraine, Russia. This is the future. The fact that these fossil fuel nations, how to take away their power, how to take away Putin's army. It's funded by the sale of gas and oil. We give Vladimir Putin $1 billion a day for his gas and oil. And that is what funds the Russian army to invade places like Ukraine. We build renewables. We stop buying gas and oil. Russia stops having these dangerous armies. It's not able to invade countries. So even for like national security, for so many reasons, the transition to a low carbon renewable economy, not relying on gas as a transition fuel, is of utmost importance right now for so many reasons, and to do that as quickly as possible. So this is my last slide. So like this is it, folks. Last chance like saloon to avoid immeasurable human suffering. We should never give up. Every degree matters, but really we're about to cross a Rubicon. Climate change isn't something for the future. It's something that's happening now. Air pollution from burning fossil fuels is responsible for 1 in 8 deaths worldwide today. 1 in 8 deaths. It's huge. And about half the global population live in areas highly vulnerable, not just vulnerable, highly vulnerable to climate change impacts. Greenhouse gases, climate change is disproportionately affecting the poor, the most vulnerable, and it's being emitted by the wealthy. And Ireland is nowhere near its fair share on emission reductions. 4.8 is measly, and we're not even on track to reach that. We need to do so much better, and it's societal transformation that's required.